the most common idea is find a category and jump in, whereas I'm never trying to find a category, but that's the difference between an entrepreneur maverick and everybody else, I guess. Everybody else is looking for the pond they want to jump into, and I'm jumping out of the pond heading somewhere else. That's why I haven't used the categorized terms.
Well, that's because you actually live beyond labels, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Hi, welcome to another edition of Beyond Labels. I'm Dr. Sina McCullough, here with my favorite co-host, Farmer Joel Salatin. And today we're actually going to talk about the label of regenerative agriculture, because I think most of us have actually been duped by this label. It is not what we think it is. And now the USDA is funding big ag in their efforts to become, quote, regenerative, which, Joel, that's our first clue that regenerative may not be what we think it is.
Yeah, well, the truth, Sina, is that all of these words, I mean, I lived through, the sustainable, everything was sustainable. And then the big tech, co-op is sustainable. And then it was organic. And then the big tech got organic. So then, the new one was regenerative. And so, there's never going to be a time when big tech doesn't try to co-opt whatever words that we use to try to differentiate. There's this, it's a constant tension between trying to differentiate and then trying to trying to glom on to the differentiation. So yeah, that's exactly what we've got, and I'm not surprised.
Yes. So most of us, I bet most of us think of the labels as like, it starts with conventional, right? And that's the one that they can use GMOs, they can use chemical spray, and they can use biosolids, which we've discussed, which is like a liquid slurry from CAFOs, for instance. They can use all that in conventional. So it would start with conventional, and then the next best thing would be organic, right, on this continuum, right? Because organic, it doesn't allow the biosolids, it doesn't allow the GMOs, it doesn't allow most pesticides and herbicides, for instance. And then on this continuum, we would go to regenerative, which is what most of us would say is beyond organic, right? And we think of it as like, this is and this is how it's marketed, that it's a climate change solution, that it is beyond organic, that they're like regenerating the soil, right? So there's this real misconception about it. And what actually, I've been actually redefining this continuum so that it makes more sense based on what we see in practice. The continuum is probably this: conventional to regenerative to organic to beyond organic, or as you would call, like, ecologically, you like to call it like ecologically raised or ecologically grown, and that's the terms that you've used in the book. So I think that is the actual continuum, and now I'm going to talk about why I think that's the actual continuum.
Yeah, and the reason I've used those terms is because I just, in all my books and all my writing, I have refused to just let myself get co-opted by whatever the word du jour, the word of the day is. And I just find that, here's what I find, that as soon as a word becomes the orthodox word, the mainstream orthodox word, it creates a category. And then and then we get, and as soon as you have a mainstream category, there's no conversation, because people assume they know what it means, and so it shuts off the conversation. So years ago, I invented the term, salad bar beef and pastured poultry and all that, because these are not mainstream terms, and they simulate a conversation. Well, what's that? And so I've done. It's interesting how it seems like the most common idea is find a category and jump in, whereas I'm never trying to find a category, but that's the difference between an entrepreneur maverick and, everybody else, I guess. Everybody else is looking for the pond they want to jump into, and I'm jumping out of the pond heading somewhere else. And so that's why I haven't used the categorized terms.
Well, that's because you actually live beyond labels, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yes.
Okay, so what are you finding, Sina?
Okay, so here's a quick rundown of what I have found. Okay, that the motivation behind regenerative was not the same as the motivation behind organic. Okay, organic, from my understanding, was largely crafted to focus on the soil health, the fertility of the soil. Regenerative, it's actually marketed, like I said, as a climate change solution. But according to the Real Organic Project, they put on this great symposium. They talked about how it wasn't actually created to address climate change. It was actually created in the Midwest to decrease costs. Okay. And the way they wanted to do that was they wanted to spray less chemical. So they came up with this idea: if they didn't till, they wouldn't have to spray as much chemical. So what the bottom line is here between the difference is that both organic and regenerative agree on certain, what I would call, positive changes. Those would include using cover crops, using livestock to increase biodiversity and whatnot, and using crop rotation. The difference, one of the main differences stemmed around the tillage. So organic would accept tillage over the chemical spray. And we're not talking about plows, right? We're talking about mixing the first 4 to 6 inches of the soil by turning carbon underneath the soil to create, turning plants into the soil to create the carbon. Whereas
here's the thing people have to understand, that if you're going to raise a specific annual crop, not a perennial, but an annual, this is something that you're going to plant a seed for: barley, wheat, oats, corn, soybeans, watermelons, squash, cucumbers. Okay, if you're going to plant, and I'm using those because there generally, when we think of garden vegetable, garden produce type stuff, we're thinking in terms of a little garden. But actually, if you go to the main, I was just in Florida last week, and I saw 100-acre fields of watermelons being picked. And so if you're going to grow a 100-acre field of watermelons, you have to kill the weeds, kill the side. You have to have a clean seed bed, or it just gets taken over by weeds. And so do you do that through stirring the ground? On a garden scale, you'd hoe. On a grand scale, you'd run a tractor with a cultivator through something that would stir the soil, versus do you use a broad spectrum herbicide? And so I'm just trying to bring people along here that if you want to plant carrots in your yard, somehow you've got to get rid of that sod. You can't just throw carrot seeds on the sod and have them grow. You've got to do some sort of seed bed preparation. And so that's what we're talking about here, is how do you get that seed bed preparation so that you can plant a crop? And obviously scale has a lot to do with this. If you're just doing it in a little garden scale, you can use a spade, a broad fork. You can put down some cardboard, let it sit for 3 or 4 months, a tarp like J.M. Fortier in Quebec, and let the worms till it up. We've done that. We've done the Paul Gauci Back to Eden. Put on a 18 inches of leaves and chips. Let it sit for a year. Again, let the worms dig it up. There are numerous ways to do that, but you can't do that on a 100-acre watermelon field. You can't do that on a 1,000-acre cornfield. And so things, the practices, as a practical matter, the practices have to change when you scale to, a commercial scale stuff.
Yes. And so the organic, as Joel just so eloquently explained, they would rather use the tillage, not from a plow, but just tilling the top of the soil over spraying. And regenerative would rather spray than till. Right. And I think most of us actually don't realize that. Right. Because like Joel was saying, regenerative has become a big misunderstood buzzword because big media got involved at the behest of the big industrial interests. Right. And so now we have all these big players that are claiming to be regenerative, like Bayer Monsanto and Syngenta and Cargill and Walmart. Like Walmart committed to change 50 million acres of their land to regenerative agriculture, right? And that's why that was a red flag for me. I was like, wait, what? Like,
yeah, well, what's happened? I think the genesis of this is also a part of that the term regenerative kind of was the next permutation from what was called conservation agriculture. So we kind of had this sustainable words, which was real early. In other words, there is an industrial agriculture thread, a green thread, if you will, and then there's the more aggressive, the outsiders. The outsiders grabbed the word organic early on. Rodale came up with that word back in the whatever 50s, and so Rodale basically invented that word, but that was always the outliers. The conventional was conservation tillage, and then sustainable, and now regenerative. So you have kind of two parallel. You have the outlier verbiage, and then you have the more industrial verbiage, and so the industrial was always looking for terminology, and felt like they couldn't use organic because it was always the outliers. It was never a USDA, what I call the USDA. It was never a USDA accepted word. So yeah, your evolution of the terminology is exactly right. It was conservation tillage, then sustainability, then regenerative. So that's why the herbicides in conservation tillage, it was all about replacing the plow with herbicide. And sustainability, the same thing. Thanks everybody for listening to this podcast with us, Beyond Labels. If you like this, share it with your friends, and we look forward, Sina and I, to visiting with you on our next Beyond Labels podcast.